There is a darkness in humanity that has manifested itself in a lust for blood throughout the ages. The Old Testament and ancient myths catalog murder and revenge as part of the fabric of life in ancient times. Cain slew Abel. Romulus slew Remus. Unleashing the beast within is a possibility for all of us. The decision to kill from passion or premeditation has often defined our world, past, present, and future. Wars have terrorized entire populations for thousands of years. The American West was home to ruthless killers who were idolized in fiction and folklore. Evil evolved to a hideous new form with the genocidal dictators of the 20th century, such as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, who ordered the death of tens of millions. But in the middle of the 20th century, a new and chilling phenomenon emerged in post-war Western society: the serial killer. As if fashioned from our nightmares, they terrify and fascinate us. Lurking behind masks of bland normality, they often evade capture for years, decades, or eternity. They are America's serial killers.
We killed her. We dumped her body off, and that was it. Nothing to it.
Every year in this country, we have about 20 serial killers, 10 of whom are apprehended, 10 of whom are on the loose. And they are, in total, responsible for some 200 deaths. So 200 victims of serial killers on a yearly basis. And what makes this particularly important for us is that the average serial killer is responsible for 10 deaths. That's a huge body count.
America's Serial Killers, Portraits in Evil, will strip the covers from a world of profiling and forensic science as we expose America's most brutal serial killers. Nothing is more innocent than children, more beautiful, more filled with hope for the future. And nothing shatters that beauty and hope more than the pedophile, the monster who preys on these innocent children. Nothing is more terrifying, more evil than the serial killer who stalks city streets looking to make a child his next victim. So when children started showing up dead and mutilated in New York City in the 1920s, the citizens of this teeming city of millions could only believe it was the work of a werewolf or vampire. In fact, the monster responsible for these unspeakable acts of violence was given the nickname the Vampire of Brooklyn. The fear of these mythical monsters is so inborn that they become a part of every child's imagination. Monsters. Monsters who wait in the dark shadows of the city, under the bed, waiting for the moment the child is just falling asleep to grab a foot or hand and drag them screaming into the night to devour them. Every child on earth has these dreams of the boogeyman. But where did these mythic creatures of evil come from before the real ones showed up? Before the serial killers of children who live among us today. Half-human monsters are as old as the myths of ancient Babylonia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. These half-human beasts were compelled to drink the blood of humans, eat their flesh in order to live. Legends of pure evil passed down through generations until the vampire and werewolf arose in medieval Europe. Werewolves arose from Old English folklore about the werewolf, meaning man-wolf. A serial killer, a truly ravenous beast whose hunger could only be satisfied by human flesh. The werewolf had no choice. To live, he had to kill and eat the flesh of a human being. Like many serial killers, the monster sneaks up on his unsuspecting prey. In this case, it is a young woman, a trademark victim of serial killers. His mind is set. He will kill this woman. He must kill. An early defense of many serial killers. Here, he is roaming the streets. He spots his next victim. She never had a chance. But were there real-life werewolves? Creatures who mutilated and feasted on the flesh of humans? One such tale is of Peter Stubb, or the Werewolf of Bedburg. Believing that he was a werewolf, he would compulsively mutilate and devour the flesh of local townspeople, including pregnant women. He enjoyed eating hard parts in hot and raw, which he accounted dainty morsels and best agreeing to his appetite. After he was caught, he was dismembered and beheaded publicly. A gruesome end for an exceptionally horrific monster. But there are other creatures that go bump in the night. He is that creature of the night. He is known as Vrykolikas, Strigoi, Nosferatu, Dracula. He is the vampire, the most infamous monster serial killer to ever grace the silver screen. The vampire is the embodiment of the psychology of the serial killer. During the day, he is dead and numb to his surroundings, but at night, he is free to satisfy his thirst and live out his fantasies. Just as many serial killers have a rich daytime fantasy life, at night, when most of society is asleep and unaware, the killer can emerge and act on his fantasy. One of the most notorious historical vampires ever to have lived was a woman, Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, who lived and killed in the 16th century. She was beautiful, sadistic, deadly. And she sucked the blood of young girls. After torturing and killing more than 650 girls, she was confined to her bedroom, never to see the light of day. Then, in 1897, Bram Stoker introduced the world to the most evil vampire ever to walk the earth, Dracula. Hauntingly sexual, he sneaks into bedrooms and drains the blood of helpless sleeping girls. He kills because he has to. Without blood, he would die. So he instinctively seeks the blood, the life essence, of innocent people. When the mutilated bodies of children began to surface in New York during the 1920s, the public had no choice but to believe that the perpetrator of these heinous acts had to be one of these monsters of the past. Jack Levin is a professor of criminology at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts.
Our early understanding of the most hideous kinds of murders, such as serial killings, kind of placed us in the category of the supernatural. There were werewolves, there were vampires who practiced cannibalism, who took the lives of their victims but also devoured them. And that was kind of the original understanding of where this dreaded phenomenon came from. But more recently, we now look at genetics rather than the supernatural to explain what we might call the bad seed. We see some of these monsters, and they are truly monsters in terms of their misdeeds, coming from nature rather than nurture. That is, they're born with a predisposition to do the most horrendous things to other human beings. That is the bad seed.
This monster was even described by one witness as the boogeyman. He was the predator of children, the devourer of human flesh, the werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn vampire, the perverted, delusional, sadomasochistic pedophile. The boogeyman turned out to be Albert Fish, who looked remarkably like your own grandfather.
Albert Fish, the cannibal, the killer, the pedophile, he personifies the most insane and grotesque aspects of sadomasochism that we've ever seen.
Well, you have what people do, and then you have the public response to what they do. His motivations for doing what he did and the way that the public then chose to portray him afterwards don't necessarily have a lot to do with each other. If you're selling newspapers, getting a cool name or getting a tagline to associate with a crime is important. And so, sure, they could come up with any names they wanted, but using words like werewolf or vampire to describe him, first of all, there's a certain accuracy there. But second of all, it ties him in to people's already existing fears and things that they already know that they're afraid of. The bogeyman stories that they already know. And so therefore you can connect this killer to a psychological fear that you've already got.
Born May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C., Fish's father died when he was young, and he was placed in an orphanage. Here he suffered and witnessed merciless beatings. He found that he enjoyed watching other boys being whipped, and that he liked being whipped himself. his dark side was beginning to emerge. Fish moved to New York City when he was 24. He frequented brothels where he rekindled his love for beatings, being paddled until his buttocks ran red with blood. He also enjoyed whipping himself for hours at a time.
Aside from killing people, Albert Fish had a lot of other pathological behaviors that he engaged in. He inserted needles into his body, into his sexual organs. He had other people do it to him. He was a person with fairly elaborate mental aberrations. And so the notion of moving from pedophilia to murder may have been a pretty easy transition for him.
Frequently moving around the country, in 1910, Fish claimed his first life in Wilmington, Delaware. But it wasn't until he was 47 that the beast within was truly free to terrorize little children. In 1917, his wife, Anna, ran off with another man, leaving him alone to provide for their 6 children. Fish settled permanently in New York City in an era when the country was changing rapidly. Indeed, America would emerge from the First World War as the undisputed leader of the world. First in industry, first in technology, first in progressive thinking. But at the same time, America of the 20s was also the jazz age, the roaring 20s. Prohibition had made the sale and consumption of alcohol illegal. Americans met the challenge by drinking more than they ever had before in gangster-run speakeasies. And everyone participated in the country's headlong grab for wealth at the expense of everything and everyone else. By 1929, the Roaring Twenties had become synonymous with lawlessness and moral decay. And no city epitomized the change in America since World War I more than New York. It was the commercial and manufacturing hub of the nation. Every road and rail line eventually ended up here, bringing even more people to feed its booming economy. By 1920, New York's population reached a staggering 6 million. All of these people crowded the city's towering canyons of cement and steel, flooded the city's tenements and slums, looking for a slice of the American dream, hoping to strike it rich. More often than not, they failed and were stuck in desperate, dead-end jobs. Separated from all that had been solid and good, they wandered through Gotham's maze of streets and alleyways, friendless, penniless, isolated from the warmth of humanity. It was through this isolation that Albert Fish found a terrifying freedom. There was nothing holding him back. A hunger began to creep into his stomach, a desire for the bodies and souls of the innocent children. He began to work in nearby YMCAs and homes for mentally challenged children. He was constantly fired because, quote, things about these children came out, close quote. Fish confessed that he liked to kill the disabled and black boys because nobody would miss them. The desire to kill again and again was never far away. It was clear to Fish that he could never stop. And on February 11th, 1927, he performed his most gruesome murder yet. A boy named Billy Gaffney was snatched through a skylight while playing in an apartment building hallway. A boy who saw the abduction told authorities, quote, "The boogeyman took him," close quote. Then, Fish grabbed his implements of hell, a knife, a handsaw, a meat cleaver, and began to get to work. Young Billy was mutilated, dismembered, his blood drained and drunk, and the rest of his body saved for food. That boogeyman, Albert Fish, ate his ears, nose, face, and belly in a stew with onions and carrots. His genitals and behind were roasted in the oven. In the end, there was nothing left.
And many of these killers, like Albert Fish and Jeffrey Dahmer, felt profoundly rejected by other human beings. And they wanted desperately to keep these people around. There's an affectionate side to cannibalism. You know, by devouring their remains, by consuming them, they become part of you forever. They don't leave. They're not rejecting you. And so there's an ambivalence in cannibalism and those who practice it.
Just as the vampire or werewolf must eat in order to survive, Fish's diabolical perversion would not go away. He claimed the innocent life of a child once more. On June 3rd, 1928, here at this cottage, Fish performed the most infamous atrocity ever to take place on American soil: the murder of Grace Budd.
When Albert Fish initially contacted that family, he was responding to an ad they'd placed in the paper for employment for their son. And I believe that it was his son that was his initial interest. But when he went to the house and he met the girl, he changed his game. He changed his intended victim to the girl. And again, it may be because she was so young, so meek, and so able to be dominated by him very easily.
And dominated she was. Like poor Billy Gaffney, she was killed, cooked, and eaten.
What's interesting about the cannibalistic aspect, especially with Albert Fish, is besides the act of doing it, is the fact that he wrote a letter detailing it to the family. That's a level of sadism that I think, he engaged in. He got some kind of enjoyment out of sending that letter. And the reality of whether he ate that little girl or not, because he was a pathological liar. Now, it's believed that he did what he said he did. And that may have been the result of curiosity. It may have been satisfied some deep psychological desire. There are serial killers who have engaged in this that feel this sort of oneness with the victim by eating them. It may have been the simple fact of what he said in his letter, which was he met a person who had engaged in it and he was curious about doing it. But you cannot deny that it is a furthering of the destruction of societal mores. Okay, if you're a pedophile, you already have sexual desire for children, you want to have sex with children, and then you do have sex with children. That's blowing away one of the deepest societal mores we have. The killing of a child, the sexual violation of a child. Then to murder someone, to take it to another step, that's yet another more you've blown out of the water. That alone can become habit forming. And you have a person who then wants to take it to yet another step. So he consumes the flesh of the victim. And then, to take it even further, writes a letter detailing how much he enjoyed it. And he sends it to the family.
Excerpt from Albert Fish letter to Grace's mother. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her, on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. She died a virgin. However, this letter was ultimately Fish's downfall, thanks to missing persons detective William King. His relentless investigation led to the arrest of the most evil monster to have walked the earth. When Fish sent the letter, he had attempted to cross out a letterhead typed on an envelope he had found. King was able to trace the address back to Fish's room in a nearby boarding house, where he was arrested on December 13th, 1934. Later, Fish confessed to killing 5 children, including Billy Gaffney and Grace Budd. However, he was implicated in 15 deaths and hundreds of molestations. X-rays revealed at least 29 needles shoved into Fish's abdomen and crotch, a self-torture that Fish believed purged him of sin.
Very few serial killers are masochistic. Most of them are sadistic, and they want very much to inflict pain and suffering on their victims so they feel good about themselves. Very few inflict pain and suffering on themselves. That's the last thing they would want. They certainly do not want to inject needles into their scrotum the way that Albert Fish did.
He was tried in 1935, where the judge quickly overruled Fish's insanity plea, stating the evidence proved premeditation and awareness during his horrible crimes. The judge sentenced him to the death penalty. But there was no penalty great enough for a demon as evil as Albert Fish. On January 16, 1936, Fish was electrocuted at Sing Sing prison.
There's a legend that has circulated about him that he shorted out the electric chair the first time because there were so many needles that he had implanted in himself that they had to do it again, and they finally executed him.
Nonetheless, a new breed of serial killer had emerged. A killer whose yearn for the life essence of children set him apart from the prostitute killing of Jack the Ripper, or the unremorseful serial killing perpetrated by H.H. Holmes and Jane Topin. This new killer truly personified the shadowy monster that will suddenly snatch your children without hesitation and eat their bodies in order to stay alive. A kind of serial killer the world was already warned about in 1931. When a chilling film about a compulsive child abductor infatuated and disgusted the world. Perhaps, in order to understand the horrors committed by child serial killer Albert Fish, the cinema, for the first time, used the sheer terror caused by the serial killer as the focal point of the movie. That film was not a product of Hollywood. It was German director Fritz Lang's brilliant 1931 cinematic classic, M. In this most chilling image, the viewer sees the serial killer, played by Peter Lorre, picking his next innocent victim, a child.
Else Beckmann.
Note the eerie sound of his whistling, a sound so unnerving the hairs on the back of the neck stand up in fear.
Dankeschön. Elsie!
Here, we hear the mother's anguished cry.
Elsie! Elsie!
Now we know the girl is dead. M draws upon all the elements from the cases of the best-known serial killers of the past. Jack the Ripper terrorizing London. The killer taunting the police. The killer craving publicity and fame. The killer as the bad seed, driven by his homicidal heritage to murder without conscience, letting everyone know he is out of control, that he will soon kill again.
Vorlesen. Der unbekannte Mörder. Ruhe! Das doch nicht! Der Schrecken unserer Stadt hat ein neues Opfer gefordert. Lauter davor, aber steht ja nicht. Aus bestimmten Anzeichen geht hervor, dass auch dieser neue Mord von demselben gespenstischen Unhold begangen wurde, dem bereits 8 Kinder unserer Stadt zum Opfer gefallen sind. Immer wieder muss nachdrücklichst darauf hingewiesen werden, dass es die heiligste Pflicht jeder Mutter, jedes Vaters ist, mehr als je ihre Kinder...
What I found is that serial killers who kill children often include some sort of sexual component. There's some kind of sexual sadism there. And I would say more often than not, those killers were themselves sexually abused as kids. And there's almost like a repetition compulsion where they feel the need to victimize others in the same way they were victimized when they were children. It's almost like their need to visit the pain they experienced upon other vulnerable victims.
Der oben erwähnte Rautenzug oder Schwellzug, Klammer, am deutlichsten in dem Worte bald, 3. Zeile von unten, Klammer zu, haben Sie?
Ja.
Registriert die pathologisch starke Sexualität dieses Triebmenschen. Punkt. Die zerbrochene Schreibart mancher anderer Buchstaben ist in ihrer zeichnerischen Weise
For the first time, the movie lets us get a look at the face of evil.
die Form der Indolenz, ja der Trägheit wählen kann. Im ganzen Schriftbild liegt ein schwer
Only insanity could explain what the killer sees when he looks at himself.
von Wahnsinn.
Ja, Herr Polizeipräsident, gewiss. Ich bezweifle durchaus nicht, dass Sie Ihre Pflicht tun. Ihre Beamten auch, gewiss. Aber das Resultat...
Now, For better than half the movie, the cops and the city's criminal element struggle with trying to catch the killer, while the actual killer disappears from the movie. For the bad guys, this type of crime is of a different kind. One so ghastly that even these hardened criminals are unwilling to embrace it. These crooks are bad, but they are not insane butchers of children. In the end, the movie says that the police, even with their somewhat sophisticated forensics, are not up to the task of catching a killer like this one. Instead, it's up to the criminals themselves to rid the city of this appalling menace. Indeed, it is the criminal underground with its network of thieves that catches the pedophile before he can kill again.
Hilfe! Hilfe! Lasst mich raus! Lasst mich raus! Ich will hinaus! Ich will hinaus! Lasst mich doch raus! Hier kommst du nicht mehr raus. Aber meine Herren, ich bitte Sie, ich weiß gar nicht, was Sie von mir wollen. Ich bitte Sie, lassen Sie mich doch frei. Das Ganze muss doch ein Irrtum sein. Ein Irrtum.
Oh nein, kein Irrtum. Ausgeschlossen. Das ist kein Irrtum. Nein, nein, kein Irrtum. Kennen Sie das? So einen Ballon hast du doch der kleinen Else Beckmann geschenkt. So einen Ballon.
Elsie. Nein! 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 Wo hast du die kleine Mackerperl verscharrt, du Hund? Aber die habe ich ja gar nicht gekannt. Ach, die hast du gar nicht gekannt. Die auch nicht, was? Und die? Und die hast du auch nicht gekannt, was? Nicht raus! Achtung, die Tür! Mach ihn feste! Wo ist Tierhund? Gib ihn! Du hast da was von Recht gesprochen. Wir sollen Recht werden.
Then, in a remarkable theatrical stunt, he is put on trial before a jury of his peers, the city's criminal underground.
Bis 15 Jahre Brandenburg. Aber ich kann doch nichts dafür! Ich kann doch nichts dafür.
In one of the most remarkable speeches in all of cinema, Peter Lorre lays out everything people thought and believed they understood at the time about the demented nature of the serial killer.
Was weißt denn du? Was redst denn du? Wer bist du denn überhaupt? Wer seid ihr denn? Alle miteinander. Verbrecher. Bildet euch womöglich noch was ein drauf, weil ihr Geldschränke knacken könnt oder Fassaden klettern oder Karten zinken. Lauter Sachen, denke ich mir, die ihr gerade so gut lassen könntet, wenn ihr was Ordentliches gelernt hättet. Oder wenn ihr arbeitet. Oder wenn ihr nicht so faule Schweine wärt. Aber ich, kann ich denn anders? Habe ich denn nicht dieses Verfluchte in mir? Das Feuer, die Stimme, die Qual.
Du willst also damit sagen, dass du morden musst?
Immer muss ich durch Straßen gehen und immer spüre ich, da ist einer hinter mir her. Das bin ich selber und verfolgt mich. Lautlos. Aber ich höre es doch. Ja, manchmal ist mir, als ob ich selber hinter mir herliefe. Ich will von mir selber davonlaufen. Aber ich kann mir nicht entkommen. Muss den Weg gehen, den es mich jagt. Muss rennen, endlose Straßen. Ich will weg. Und mit mir rennen die Gespenster von Müttern, von Kindern. Die gehen nie mehr weg. Die sind immer da. Immer. Nur nicht, wenn ich's tue. Dann weiß ich von nichts mehr. Dann stehe ich vor einem Plakat und lese, was ich getan habe, und lese. Was habe ich getan? Aber ich weiß doch von gar nichts. Aber wer glaubt mir denn? Wer weiß denn, wie sie mir aussieht? Wie es schreit und brüllt da innen, wie ich tun muss, will nicht, muss, und dann schreit eine Stimme und ich kann es nicht mehr hören. Hilfe! Ich kann nicht!
When you have a character like Peter Lorre's character in M, fascinating. Maybe he couldn't help himself in a general sense, but did he kill every little kid he saw? Or did he pick and choose the right time, the right place, the right way of going about it to evade capture and avoid detection? There was an element of choice involved.
The motion picture portrayal is more myth than reality. Actually, serial killers don't need a precipitating event. They don't have to see just the right victim in front of them before they decide to strike. And they're certainly not compelled to kill. They enjoy it. It makes them feel good about themselves, and they see it as a great accomplishment. But there's no compulsion. In fact, they can stop, and some of them have.
Incredibly, after M's release, the serial killer phenomena all but disappeared from the American scene. During the Great Depression and World War II, serial killers vanished, only to reappear with an explosion of killing in the 1950s.